Paradoxes at the Limits, Kierkegaard's Corrective to Hegel. Some of the returning themes in his published work are encapsulated in an entry from Kierkegaard's 1850 journals as he reflects on what he takes to be a fundamental error. This is passage number 1. It is a fundamental error to hold that there are no negative concepts. The highest principles of all thinking, or the proofs of these principles, are of course negative. Human reason has boundaries. That is where the negative concepts lie. Boundary skirmishes are negative, constraining. But people have a twaddling and conceited concept of human reason, especially in our times, when one never thinks of a thinker, a reasonable human being, but of pure reason and the like, which do not exist at all, inasmuch as there is no one, be he a professor or whatever, who is pure reason. Pure reason is a fantasy, and this is also the seat of the fantastic boundlessness in which there are no negative concepts, but where everything is grasped, like the witch who ended up eating her own stomach. Well, as indicated by his references to our times, professors, and pure reason and the like, Kierkegaard associates the error he has in mind with modern academic philosophy, that is, with the then dominant tradition of German idealism, culminating in Hegel's conception of philosophy as presuppositionless logical science. Another striking entry in his journals expressly invokes the German tradition as a foil for Kierkegaard's vision of an alternative Danish style of philosophy. This is quote number 2. Danish philosophy, should there ever be talk of such a thing, will differ from German philosophy in that in no wise will it begin with nothing or without any presupposition or explain everything by mediating, since it begins, on the contrary, with the proposition that there are many things between heaven and earth which no philosophy has explained. By being incorporated into philosophy, this proposition will provide the due corrective and will also cast a humorous, edifying perturbation over it all. Well, the Shakespearean allusion to Hamlet's line to Horatio about the many things not dreamt of by your philosophy is itself characteristic of the literary qualities of Kierkegaard's writings, reflecting their stance against any conception of philosophy as a self-standing logical science or system of pure reason. But what could it mean for Hamlet's proposition to be incorporated into philosophy? What are negative concepts, and what is their place in Kierkegaard's envisioned corrective to German system building? And what exactly is supposed to be wrong with the approach of those who would, quote, explain everything by mediating? Well, as a way to take up these questions, I propose in this paper to re-examine Kierkegaard's thinking about paradoxes. My aim is threefold. First, I aim to show how he understands paradoxes as spurs to inquiry, where this conception takes shape in critical dialogue with, not simple opposition to, Hegel. Secondly, however, I aim to clarify Kierkegaard's conception of the special type of paradox he thinks cannot be mediated or explained away. Limit paradoxes, as I'll call them. And thirdly, I aim to explain why, far from simply acting as blocks to rational inquiry, he thinks limit paradoxes can be incorporated into philosophy, as disclosing our situatedness as human thinkers and helping to reorient our thinking away from abstract speculation and toward existential problems. In my view, Kierkegaard's thinking about paradoxes diverges from Hegel's in significant ways. Despite its polemical tendencies, however, I also think it's a mistake to see Kierkegaard's work in this regard, or in general, as standing in simple opposition to Hegel's. In this connection, his choice of words in the 1844 entry just cited, outlining his vision for a Danish philosophy, is telling. What he seeks, he says, is the due corrective. I'll begin, therefore, by showing how, in his thinking about paradoxes, Kierkegaard's point of departure is broadly Hegelian. Section 1, Paradoxes as Spurs to Inquiry. In his introductory remarks on the ancient Megarians in his lectures on the history of philosophy, Hegel comments on these philosophers' reputation for devising tricky paradoxes. In this, he observes, they exemplify a feature common to many of the rival schools of Greek philosophy. From the vantage point of his own philosophical project, Hegel offers the following account of the Greek penchant for paradoxes. Passage number 3. The Greeks were quite enamored of discovering contradictions met with in speech and in ordinary ideas. The contradiction does not make its appearance as a pure contradiction in the conception, but only as interwoven with concrete ideas. Such propositions neither apply to the concrete content nor to the pure notion. Subject and predicate, of which every proposition consists, are different, but in the ordinary idea we signify their unity. This simple unity, which does not contradict itself, is to ordinary ideas the truth. But in fact, the simple self-identical proposition is an unmeaning tautology, for in any affirmation, differences are present, and because their diversity comes to consciousness, there is contradiction. But the ordinary consciousness is then at an end, for only where there is a contradiction is there the solution, self-abrogation. Well, these ideas are illustrated by Hegel's ensuing discussion of the liar paradox, which he formulates in the Megarian way as a question. If a man acknowledges that he lies, does he lie or speak the truth? This question discovers a contradiction met with in speech and ordinary ideas in the sense that it appears to require the answer that the speaker both lies and does not lie. For our ordinary understanding, which demands a simple answer one way or the other, this contradiction will not do. Hegel comments, a touch sardonically, on what then happens as thinkers struggle by relying on their ordinary understanding to solve the paradoxes that arise within it. Passage number 4. Chrysippus, a celebrated Stoic, wrote 6 books on the subject, and another, Philetus of Cos, died in the decline which he contracted through overstudy of these paradoxes. We have the same thing over again when, in modern times, we see men worn out by absorbing themselves in the squaring of the circle. But Hegel does not wish to dismiss such paradoxes as the liar as mere trifles or wordplay, unfitting objects of serious philosophical attention. On the contrary, he thinks paradoxes, i.e. questions whose answers appear to require the affirmation of contradictions, paradoxes have a vital role to play in providing philosophical inquiry with motivation, direction, and structure. By throwing into confusion the ordinary modes of understanding from whence they arise, paradoxes motivate the self-abrogation of this very standpoint, exposing its inadequacies and driving the search for a more satisfying perspective on the concepts involved. For, as Hegel says, only where there is a contradiction is there the solution, self-abrogation. Why blame paradoxes like the liar on the very structure of our ordinary modes of thought and talk? From his discussion of the Megarian paradoxes, including the Sorites as well as the liar, it's clear that Hegel regards the following 2 general features of our ordinary understanding as systemically paradox-generating. Firstly, the ordinary understanding is structured by conceptual pairs that appear to stand in external relations of fixed opposition, including these: light versus dark, positive versus negative, universal, individual, infinite, finite, identical, distinct, immediate, mediated, essence, appearance. Particularly germane to the liar is, of course, the opposition true, false. On Hegel's diagnosis, it's because we ordinarily conceive of truth as simple and as standing in a simple opposition to falsehood that the liar emerges for us as a paradox. More generally, paradoxes are the inevitable product of the way our ordinary understanding is structured by such fixed oppositions. Accordingly, what drives the self-abrogation of this mode of understanding is ultimately the need for a perspective in which, as Hegel puts it in the Logic, all the oppositions that are assumed as fixed, as for example finite and infinite, individual and universal, are disclosed to us in a wholly new light as, after all, quote, not in contradiction. Secondly, our ordinary modes of thought and talk lead us to mix up different levels in the applications of concepts. Consider, for example, the proposition that the speaker in The Liar both lies and does not lie. While our ordinary understanding requires us to reject this proposition as contradictory, it also leads us into wanting to affirm it as we try simultaneously to represent the concrete content of the speaker's utterance, that he's lying, while also saying something more abstract about his utterance itself, that it exemplifies truth. For Hegel, this means that such propositions hover unstably between these two levels, interweaving the two but settling on neither. Such propositions, he writes, neither apply to the concrete content nor to the pure notion. Quite generally, it's a feature of our ordinary modes of thought and talk that these can be both about things, objects, and about the concepts and terms that we use to think and talk about things, a feature that systemically generates paradoxes. You might also think in this connection of Frege and his paradoxical statement, the concept horse is not a concept. We can therefore summarize a recognizably Hegelian conception of paradoxes in general as follows. A paradox is a question whose answer, from the perspective of our ordinary understanding, requires the affirmation of a contradiction, which then drives the search for a higher perspective on the concepts the paradox involves. From the paradoxes themselves, moreover, lessons can be learned about what this higher perspective must afford. It must transcend the fixed oppositions of our ordinary understanding, and it must ascend to contemplate the sphere of the conceptual as such, in a way that's pure, unmixed with ordinary ideas. Now consider the opening of chapter 3 of Philosophical Crumbs. In the older translations, it was translated as Philosophical Fragments, attributed to Kierkegaard's fictional philosopher, one Johannes Climacus. Entitled The Absolute Paradox, a Metaphysical Caprice, this chapter opens as follows, passage number 5. Despite the fact that Socrates used all his powers in an effort to understand human nature and to know himself, despite the fact that he's been lauded through the centuries as the person who best understood human nature, he claimed the reason he was disinclined to contemplate the nature of creatures such as Pegasus and Gorgon was that he was not quite certain whether he, the expert on human nature, was a stranger monster than Typhon, or a gentler and simpler being that by nature participated in something divine. Cf. Phaedrus 229e. This appears to be a paradox. What appears to be a paradox? Well, commentators on this passage typically rehearse the tension between Socrates' reputation for unparalleled insight and his own professions of ignorance. While Climacus no doubt uses this contrast to frame his point, I think the paradox he identifies here is something else. In Plato's Phaedrus, Socrates describes his turn towards self-knowledge as a departure from speculation about mythical beings like Pegasus, Gorgon, or Typhon. However, Socrates also says he is perplexed about how he compares to these non-human beings, uncertain whether he's a stranger monster than Typhon or a gentler divine creature. The paradox, then, is that in turning toward himself and abandoning speculation about mythological others, Socrates finds himself comparing his own enigmatic nature with those very same non-human beings. Thus, Socrates' inward turn is simultaneously an outward turn toward otherness and difference. Notably, this Socratic paradox fits the Hegelian model. The question of whether Socrates' turn inward is a turn away from others invites a yes and no answer, or rather it demands such an answer from a perspective that views self and other in simple opposition. To resolve the paradox, it appears, we need to understand how knowledge of other beings can be implicated in Socrates' search for self-knowledge, and for that we need a perspective from which selfhood can be understood as constitutively other-directed. Indeed, we might add that as a good post-Hegelian, Kierkegaard later provides just such a perspective in his book Sickness Unto Death. There, Climacus' Christian counterpart, Anti-Climacus, defines the self as a self-relating relation that is also constituted through its relations to others, and ultimately to God. Returning to Crumbs, this reading of its opening lines clarifies why chapter 3 begins as it does. For Climacus proceeds to construct another paradox on the model of Socrates' turning toward and turning away from alterity, the same paradox, as it were, writ large. Climacus pursues this metaphysical caprice by positing a paradoxical dynamic within thought itself. He starts with the idea that human thought is driven by a passion to understand that which appears to resist comprehension. This passion propels thought forward, overcoming paradoxes and expanding the boundaries of understanding, striving to assimilate and make things its own. And yet, Climacus supposes, in this very dynamic of pushing back frontiers, human thought is driven also by a will to transcend itself, to discover something radically beyond itself, something absolutely other. Under this aspect, human thought harbors within itself a kind of death wish. Passage number 6. But the highest power of every passion is always to will its own annihilation. Thus, it's also the highest passion of the understanding to desire an obstacle, despite the fact that the obstacle in one way or another may be its downfall. This is the highest paradox of thought, to want to discover something it cannot think. This passion of thought is fundamentally present everywhere in thought, also in the thought of the individual, to the extent that in thinking, he transcends himself. It's only because thinking is for us so habitually ingrained that we typically fail to notice its paradoxical dynamic of incorporating within itself that which it also wants to encounter as beyond itself. Rather, Climacus suggests, as we fail to notice the aspect under which walking is a continually arrested process of falling. This line of argument relies on the following two premises. Premise 1, it belongs to human thought to be driven by a passion to overcome obstacles to understanding. Premise 2, it belongs to all passions ultimately to seek their own annihilation. Premise 1 recalls Hegel's conception of paradoxes as zetetic spurs. Indeed, there's much to support it in Hegel's account of the inner logic of the history of philosophy as a series of perspective shifts motivated in their turn by the desire to resolve paradoxes at the previous level. Particularly in the light of the plausible role that anomalies and paradoxes play in scientific progress, as described, for example, by Thomas Kuhn, further evidence for Climacus's premise might be sought from the sphere of the natural sciences. Premise 2 also bears comparison with Hegel's idea of a form of understanding which, in the face of the paradoxes to which it gives rise, is driven to find a way forward through self-abrogation. However, whereas Hegel evidently thinks this process can be brought to a satisfactory end through the higher standpoint attained in his own philosophy, i.e. the speculative perspective afforded by logical science, Climacus supposes that human thought is driven as such by the passion for self-abrogation. What might be said in favour of this? Well, in his commentary on Philosophical Crumbs, Jacob Howland reconstructs Climacus's reasoning as follows, quote, passion wills its own downfall because it's not its own end. Unlike the love of the god, which does not have the satisfaction of need outside itself but within, passion is a longing for something beyond itself. But why think of the passion to overcome obstacles to human understanding in particular as having its satisfaction outside itself? Plausibly, Climacus's idea is that this passion could never be satisfied by what it regards as readily understood. Instead, it seeks out that which resists being understood. This is the sense in which, moved by this passion, human thought is constitutively oriented toward that which lies beyond itself. Even if we accept this much, it does not follow that thought's death wish could ever be fulfilled. Perhaps, as it turns out, the real is the rational, and there is simply nothing that thought cannot ultimately make its own. In that case, while cruder forms of understanding may progressively give way to more sophisticated forms, the self-abrogation of thought as such must always remain beyond its reach. Climacus's metaphysical caprice, however, involves trying to find something that really does satisfy the condition, quote, something that it, that is human thought, cannot think. I'll turn shortly in the second section to consider what he thinks might satisfy that condition. But let me first clarify the sense in which, supposing it was successful, Climacus's venture in paradox construction may have critical purchase against Hegel. For there arises here an interpretive puzzle. On the one hand, it appears that what Climacus is looking for is a paradox for which there can be no possible solution. He seeks a question that requires a contradictory answer, not merely relative to ordinary understanding, but for human thought as such. On the other hand, in his postscript to Philosophical Crumbs, when Climacus turns his critical attention against Hegelian philosophy in a more direct and sustained way, he's often taken to criticize Hegelians for having transgressed the law of non-contradiction. How then can Climacus have it both ways, presenting certain contradictions as absolute and unavoidable, while taking Hegelians to task for failing to avoid them? The solution to this puzzle, I submit, partly depends on seeing that Climacus does not fault Hegel, or Hegelian philosophers more broadly, for violating the law of non-contradiction by affirming contradictions as true. Instead, as the relevant passages in postscript in fact make quite clear, the target of his criticism in this regard is the claim to have radically transcended the perspective from within which, as he supposes Hegelian philosophers will readily agree, the law of non-contradiction quite properly applies. For example, passage 7, that the language of abstract thought does not really allow the difficulty with existence and for the one who exists to emerge, can be illustrated by reference to a crucial problem about which so much has been said and written. As everyone knows, the Hegelian philosophy has done away with the law of contradiction, and Hegel himself has more than once passed a scathing judgment on those thinkers who remained in the sphere of understanding and reflection. Hegel is utterly and absolutely right in saying that when viewed eternally, under the aspect of eternity in the language of abstraction, in pure thought and pure being, there is no either-or. Where the devil should it be, once abstraction has taken away the contradiction? As Climacus sees it, Hegel claims to occupy a perspective from which the paradoxes that confound our ordinary thought and talk no longer arise. It's just in this sense, in just this sense, he lays claim to a perspective in which the law of non-contradiction is done away with, a standpoint from which he takes himself to be in a position, as it were, to look down on any thinker who, in the face of tricky paradoxes and while remaining under the sway of our ordinary understanding, might still feel under pressure to affirm a contradiction. Climacus's line of criticism therefore by no means relies on the claim that Hegel himself affirms propositions of the form P and not P. Now, it is true that some recent critics do interpret Hegel in this way, as anticipating more recent developments in dialethic logic. For example, it's recently been argued that Hegel offers a dialethic solution to the liar in particular, in which the contradictory verdict of ordinary reflection, that the speaker both lies and does not lie, is ultimately vindicated by the higher perspective of paraconsistent logic. On the alternative reading that I think we may safely attribute to Kierkegaard, however, the perspective of pure thought annuls or suspends or rescinds the law of non-contradiction, but doesn't violate it. That is, it's supposed to enable us to see how, despite the appearances, both and answers to paradoxical questions can be formulated in ways that do not contravene this principle. So understood, Hegel's strategy builds on the idea that paradoxes serve to expose what, in his discussion of the Megarians, he characterizes as the contradictory and unsatisfactory nature of common speech, that is, when taken strictly as it's spoken. As Climacus reads Hegel, then, ordinary understanding and reflection lead to paradox in ways that motivate philosophical assent, to a purely reflexive mode of thought and discourse, contemplating the totality of pure concepts. Compatibly with this reading, the shift to pure reflexivity is not by itself supposed to be sufficient to resolve all contradictions. Rather, the resolution of paradoxes is the telos of a laborious dialectical process, the work of logical science, that operates by counteracting the processes through which pure concepts come to appear to our ordinary ways of thinking in external relations of fixed opposition. In this way, the Hegelian philosopher seeks, in turn, to negate the processes through which the concepts which structure our ordinary understanding negate themselves by appearing in relations of fixed opposition, misleading us into paradox in the first place. The critical question Climacus wants to raise in this connection is therefore not whether Hegel objectionably violates the law of non-contradiction, but instead whether the perspective to which he lays claim, the abstract standpoint of pure reflexivity, truly admits of being occupied by situated human thinkers. As he formulates his worry elsewhere in postscript, passage 8, it is said that the absoluteness of the law of contradiction is an illusion that vanishes in the face of thinking. Correct. But then again, the abstraction of thinking is a phantom that vanishes in the face of the actuality of existence. The concession here is again striking. Hegel is perfectly correct that were it possible for us to occupy the purely abstract perspective of pure thought, there would then be nothing in the offing for the law of non-contradiction to rule out, i.e. we would then feel no pressure to violate it. But Climacus doubts that this perspective is one that situated thinkers like us can truly be said to occupy. Why so? Well, as we'll now see, a major source of his skepticism in this regard is his conception of a certain type of paradox. Section 2, paradoxes as perspectival limits. While Climacus' discussion in chapter 3 of Crumbs contains many twists and turns, two key paradoxes emerge as candidates for what might satisfy the condition of that which, in principle, human thought cannot assimilate. These are, first, the paradox of divine transcendence, that is, the thought of God, qua absolutely other, as that which cannot be grasped in thought. Second, the paradox of self-attributed sinfulness, the thought of oneself, qua human, as in a condition of unqualified spiritual darkness or untruth. First paradox, transcendence for short, is a familiar problem in religious discourse. Two classic expressions are these. First is from Nicholas of Cusa, and then Pseudo-Dionysius. Nicholas, there can be nothing greater in existence than the simple absolute maximum, i.e. God, and since it is greater than our powers of comprehension, for it is infinite truth, our knowledge of it can never mean that we can comprehend it. Is Pseudo-Dionysius, for the supravital and primal life is the cause of all life. It produces life in a supravital manner and is above all life and is therefore described by whatsoever human terms may express that life which is ineffable. Whatsoever human terms may express that life which is ineffable. Nicholas seems to be thinking about that which cannot in principle be thought. Pseudo-Dionysius appears to be naming that which cannot in principle be named. Here's a more recent example of a theologian trying, so to speak, to F the ineffable. This is from Peter Klein. Neither substance nor subject, God is nothing. God's nothingness is not some static accomplished vacuity, it's an infinitely active withdrawal from objectivity and mediation, rather than a motionless black void, which would be too objective. God's nothingness nothings, negating even its own nothingness as static. God is a nothing-ing, neither this nor that. Well, the stratagems developed by theologians and mystics for navigating transcendence include not least Aquinas' ways of analogy, idealization, and negation. Climacus, however, argues that no such technique for indicating God, to use Klein's expression, is ever going to truly overcome the problem. Treating the term God algebraically by means of the placeholder the unknown, he writes, passage 9, defined as the absolutely different, the unknown would appear to be on the way to being revealed. But this is not so, because absolute difference cannot even be thought, because the understanding cannot absolutely negate itself, but uses itself in order to do this. It cannot go beyond itself absolutely, and thus conceives this thing that transcends itself by means of itself. By this argument, it's self-defeating to define the unknown as that which radically transcends human understanding, because doing so is itself a form of human understanding. Or as Graham Priest more pithily puts it, whereof we cannot speak, thereof we have just contradicted ourselves. On these grounds, Climacus denies the understanding can get any further in disclosing the unknown, whether via negation, analogy, or idealization. Either such devices really do disclose the nature of something, in which case what they disclose does not truly transcend thought as such, or he insists they disclose nothing and leave us no further. Notably, difficulties of this sort are not unique to Christian theologians. They arise for any attempt to conceive of God or nirvana or the world as will as absolutely other. By contrast, the paradox of self-attributed sinfulness, call it degeneracy for short, that paradox arises from Climacus's portrayal of the specifically Christian doctrine of human sinfulness. In his portrayal, Christianity teaches that human beings have freely alienated themselves from God, the eternal truth, and have thereby lost even the condition for understanding their own condition. Their only hope rests on being recreated so that they might receive in faith God's self-revelation in Christ, the paradoxical God-man. Apart from this, we are, as it were, without a spiritual compass, unable even to orient ourselves aright to our own degeneracy. Well, the degeneracy paradox is not implied by mere human fallibility, though self-attributed fallibility does yield a weaker kind of paradox, as in the case of the preface paradox. The issue here is not just that humans sometimes err, but that concerning eternal truth, our spiritual capacities are radically and irremediably corrupted. Irremediably, that is, without divine grace. Notably, Climacus makes no suggestion that Christianity teaches we can't approximate to objective truth in, say, context of natural science. But what exactly is supposed to be paradoxical here? We can think of it as a kind of super liar. In the course of his discussion of rebirth, as the divine regeneration that enables entry into spiritual truth, Climacus raises the question of whether this idea is even conceivable, i.e. whether it's capable of being thought, in Danish, lade sig tænke. He remarks, passage number 10, before we reply, we must ask who it is who should answer the question. To be born, is that conceivable? Yes, why not? But to whom is it conceivable? One who has been born or one who has not yet been born? The latter is preposterous and could not have occurred to anyone. When he who has been born thinks of himself as having been born, he thinks of this transition from not being to being. This must also be the case with respect to rebirth, because it would be preposterous for one who had not been reborn to think it, and would it not be laughable that such a thing could occur to him? So the difficulty with present tense self-attributions of degeneracy does not presuppose the truth of Christian doctrine, for it concerns whether this teaching is so much as conceivably true. At a certain level of abstraction, what is paradoxical about degeneracy is the same as in the case of transcendence. Both paradoxes share the form, I'm thinking a thought that according to its content, I couldn't possibly be thinking. Both paradoxes are therefore performative. They arise from acts of thinking and involve a sense of self-stultification or performative contradiction. In chapter 3 of Crumbs, Climacus proceeds to argue that when human thought confronts doctrines of divine transcendence or human sinfulness, it can neither assimilate these teachings nor dismiss them as nonsense. Instead, the passion for understanding now splits into two possible trajectories, what he calls the happy passion of faith, which surrenders to that which it can't assimilate, finding satisfaction in the encounter with the radically transcendent, or on the other hand, the unhappy passion of offense, which refuses to surrender, remaining perpetually frustrated by its inability to resolve or dismiss the paradoxes. Now, Climacus's particular focus on transcendence and degeneracy no doubt reflects his overall interest in Christianity, and specifically in whether the latter can be rationally reconstructed. Certainly a live question within the philosophical tradition to which he responds, not least in the wake of Kant's religion book. Christian doctrines are not the only source of limit paradox, however. A third paradox that plays a prominent role in Postscript and elsewhere in Kierkegaard's writings, has no special relation to Christianity, namely, third, the paradox of mortality, the thought of oneself as at some time dead. Now, it is, of course, as certain as anything is, that we will all someday die. But the sense of paradox here can be evoked by the question, can you imagine yourself at your own funeral? Freud thought not. Quote, it is impossible to imagine our own death, and whenever we attempt to do so, we are still present as spectators, end quote. Climacus highlights in this connection the contrast between objective, third-personal knowledge about death and the first-personal understanding that death could come at any moment to me. Having enumerated all the facts he knows about death, he confesses, I can in no way consider death something I've understood. Echoing Epicurus, he continues, number 11, I would then have to ask whether it's possible at all to have any idea of death, whether it can be anticipated and experienced anticipando in an idea, or whether it's only when it actually occurs. And since its actual being is a non-being, whether it follows that it is only when it's not. This difficulty can also be put by asking whether someone living can approach death at all, since there's no way in which he can come close enough experimentally without thereby becoming comically a victim of his own experiment, while in the experience itself he cannot hold back, but then learns nothing from the experience, being unable to extract himself from it and profit from it later. Climacus's difficulties with death evidently stem from the attempt to project himself into a condition where he's no longer around, hence one in which he cannot experience being no longer around. The impression of paradox, again, here is performative, where the act of thinking undercuts the concept being thought, as though one were trying to saw off the branch upon which one remains perched. Climacus maintains that such paradoxes can't be dissolved by the Hegelian move to a higher perspective on the concepts involved. Why he draws this conclusion emerges more clearly in postscript in such passages as the following, number 12. All honour to the Herr Professor. I say this not to deprive him of his honour, as if I too could suspend the paradox, not at all. But if the Professor has suspended it, I dare say it is indeed neutralised, unless the suspending concerns the Professor more than the paradox, so that the Professor, instead of neutralising the paradox, himself became an alarming fantastical protuberance. In other cases, it's assumed that explaining something is to make its meaning clear, that it is this and not something else. Explaining the paradox would then be to grasp ever more deeply what the paradox is, and that it is the paradox. Thus, God is a supreme conception, not to be explained through something else, but only by deepening oneself in the very conception. The highest principles of all thought can be demonstrated only indirectly, negatively. Supposing the paradox to be the limit for the relation of someone existing to an eternal essential truth, then neither can the paradox be explained by something else, if the explanation is for someone existing. Well, okay, so here the paradox primarily refers to transcendence, the thought of God as all-surpassing, and Herr Professor evidently stands for modern Christian speculation, i.e. the Hegelian approaches to Christian doctrine that Climacus presents as his primary critical target. In the way he tries to suspend and neutralize the paradox, Climacus fears that Herr Professor may wind up suspending himself as an existing thinker, getting himself confused with pure thought. But the crux of his critique is the idea of a paradox that marks, quote, the limit for the relation of someone existing to an eternal essential truth. What's crucial here, and what I believe is typically missed by the critics, is that this type of paradox is not reducible to contradictory propositions, not even to apparent contraries or oppositions. I propose to call paradoxes of this type limit paradoxes. Their general form is not, for example, x is both f and g, where f and g appear opposed. For example, x is both temporal and eternal. Rather, limit paradoxes arise from the relation between certain types of abstract thought content on the one hand, and on the other hand, temporally situated human thinkers. This returns us to the performative character of these paradoxes. It's plausibly because of their performative character that Climacus is ready to concede that limit paradoxes could be neutralized if we could occupy a perspective that abstracts away entirely from the first-personal, temporally situated perspective of the existing thinker. I think a comparison suggests itself here with Moore's paradox. This paradox can be represented by the two schematic sentences, P, but I don't believe that P, and I believe that P, but not P. The puzzle presented by a given substitution instance of one of these sentences is how to make sense of the following. First, it appears in some way self-contradictory, but two, it doesn't have the form of a logical contradiction. There are many possible worlds in which it's both the case that P, say it's raining outside, and that I don't believe it. This is the sense in which Moore's sentences are paradoxical. Considered as situated present tense thoughts or utterances, they appear to be self-defeating despite not being logically contradictory. So understood, Moore's paradox is a limit paradox. On the model of more sentences, transcendence, degeneracy, and mortality might be represented by the schema P, but I can't think it. For example, God is infinitely other, but I can't think it. Now Herr Professor comes along and diffuses the paradox by showing how the finite and the infinite are not in simple opposition and how to overcome all such oppositions of the ordinary understanding between the temporal and the eternal, identity and difference, self and other, God and man. Climacus' retort is that we could no doubt make the paradox disappear if we could abstract away entirely from the first-person perspective of the temporally situated thinker. Compare, there's nothing at all paradoxical about more sentences from a purely logical point of view. For we would then be abstracting away from the perspectival conditions under which the paradox arises. But if we did somehow manage to abandon these conditions altogether, what we would then be suspending is really our own perspective as existing thinkers. This then is the sense in which Climacus thinks certain paradoxes arise for human thought as such, and not merely relative to pre-philosophical modes of thought and talk. Some questions, he maintains, are such that if we try to answer them, we find ourselves in a predicament of self-stultification, trying to grasp or express abstract content that, by its own lights, we're in no position to grasp or express as situated thinkers. For example, can you conceive of your own death? Climacus readily concedes that limit paradoxes would disappear were we able to occupy a purely logical, content-directed, third-personal point of view. And he readily allows that our human capacities for abstract and reflexive thought make it possible for us in significant ways to transcend our empirical actuality. But what he refuses to concede is that even in its most abstract forms, human thought could ever wholly detach itself from its situatedness in human life and the first-person perspective. Okay, third and final section, limit paradoxes as spurs to situated thought. From a Hegelian point of view, the suspicion may linger that Climacus' stance is really at bottom just another expression of that form of religious consciousness that sets itself in opposition to reason under an impoverished conception of reason as mere intellect. In Faith and Knowledge, Hegel wrote, passage 13, after its battle with religion, the best that reason could manage was to take a look at itself and come to self-awareness. Reason, having in this way become mere intellect, acknowledges its own nothingness by placing that which is better than it in a faith outside and above itself, as a beyond. This is what happened in the philosophies of Kant, Jacobi, and Fichte. Philosophy has made itself the handmaid of a faith once more. In this light, one might suspect that in the last analysis, Climacus' forays into the mysteries of the religious amount to little more than a variation on the theme that for reason, for cold, hard, unfeeling reason, faith can only appear as an unreachable beyond. But we should not be too quick to interpret Climacus' appeals to limit paradoxes in the terms in which Hegel understands, for example, Jacobi's fideism. For one thing, Climacus presents himself as an unbelieving philosopher-humorist whose project is clarificatory rather than apologetic. His stated overall aim is to clear up, quote, the misunderstanding between Christianity and philosophy, end quote. Notably, moreover, he expressly distances himself from Jacobi, for example, whose earnest exhortations to take the leap of faith Climacus enjoys sending up. But if his construction of limit paradoxes is not in the service of an apology for fideism, what exactly is he up to? Recalling Kierkegaard's vision of a Danish corrective to German philosophy, we may also ask, how might whatever Climacus is up to serve to advance a style of philosophy that incorporates Hamlet's proposition to the effect that some things can't be explained? So before closing, I hope to shed some further light on these issues by showing how Climacus conceives of limit paradoxes not in a merely negative way as unyielding obstacles to thought, but more positively as capable of disclosing our situatedness as human thinkers and reorienting our thinking in ways that more properly reflect and express this situatedness. Notwithstanding their source in inescapable perspectival limits, he thinks, these paradoxes can still act as a spur to inquiry, not toward a higher level perspective on the domain of conceptuality as such, but instead toward more humanly situated forms of thought. Consider again the Herr Professor passage from Postscript that we looked at a moment ago. To recall some lines that our discussion has so far passed over, it's just repeating these lines. In other cases, it's assumed that explaining something is to make its meaning clear, that it's this and not something else. Explaining the paradox would then be to grasp ever more deeply what the paradox is, and that it is the paradox. Thus, God is a supreme conception, not to be explained through something else, but only by deepening oneself in the very conception. Climacus here anticipates a critical question. If we refrain from trying to neutralize the paradox by ascending to an impersonal perspective from which it vanishes, must we then simply abandon understanding and fall back into baffled silence? Climacus answers, in effect, that while the conception of God as supremely transcendent does resist definition and conceptual articulation, it remains, in Cora Diamond's nice phrase, a great riddle. This does not mean that it can't be, in a sense, explained. Explaining the paradox for Climacus involves growing in one's grasp of the paradox as paradox. It's about deepening, not resolving or dissolving. Once we acknowledge the perspectival limits of our thought, there therefore remains a vital task with respect to these limits, to understand ourselves in relation to them, and to do so ever more deeply. For Climacus, then, far from being simply unyielding obstacles to inquiry, limit paradoxes are apt to reorient our understanding, directing us away from speculative theology, abstract explanations, theistic proofs, and the like, and back toward more situated forms of thought, reconnecting the concepts they deploy with what matters to us as human beings. This view resists the charge of fideism, for Climacus is not arguing for a leap beyond thought, but for a reorientation and deepening within thought. But how is this to be accomplished, and what kind of depth is at issue? Climacus envisages a distinctive mode of thought and inquiry as a counter-movement to what he calls the objective tendency, which seeks maximal reflective distance in order to understand the concrete abstractly. While he thinks typified by idealist philosophy and speculative theology, he sees this tendency and the spectator's stance it idealizes as a hallmark of modern thought more generally. The counter-movement he envisages seeks instead to understand the abstract concretely, where this requires imagination, feeling, and dialectics with passion in the inwardness of existing. End of quote. This reorientation applies both to the subject matter, what Climacus calls the what, and to the style or character of one's thinking, the how. With respect to the what, we're to be directed away from abstract doctrinal speculation toward existence problems, i.e. the problems that arise for us not in any particular role or capacity, but simply in virtue of being human. Climacus's paradigm of an existence problem is our human exposure to suffering. Are we to respond to suffering as a mere meaningless tragedy? Must we refuse to seek meaning where there is none? Or might suffering be understood religiously, as essential to a life that finds fulfillment in God, rather than finite goods that are always hostage to fortune? Climacus insists that suffering is essential to religious life, which demands the continual effort to resist investing finite things with absolute value, resisting idolatry. So understood, religion cannot be reduced to correct doctrine or ritual. It demands the difficult task of living all things as finite, treating nothing worldly as of absolute value. Closely related existence problems concern guilt, powerlessness, and lost innocence. Are guilt and feelings of ethical failure to be wished away or overcome by effort, or must we accept them as part of the human condition? Again, Climacus supposes that under a religious interpretation, guilt consciousness fundamentally discloses our sinfulness, not simply as having fallen into discrete acts of wrongdoing, but as those whose profound fall away from the good shapes their whole being. It's a totality category in his term. Now, although he evidently has a particular interest in religious responses to existence problems, Climacus himself, writing as a humorist, does not personally embrace them. Instead, he seeks to reanimate our thinking by reconnecting religious ideas, such as transcendence and sin, to the existential problems they address. His critique of speculative theology is that it turns these concepts into abstract posits, severed from their existential roots. Limit paradoxes have a vital role to play in restoring this connection. By frustrating purely theoretical interests in religious concepts, and by highlighting their performative dimensions, Such paradoxes can direct us back to the existential sphere in which these concepts are truly at home. The process is not automatic. There's nothing magical about the encounter with paradox. But when we're attuned to this potential, limit paradoxes may help to reorient our thinking toward the concrete problems that arise for us as situated thinkers. Finally, the how. That is the style of thinking that Climacus thinks properly reflects our human situatedness. He insists that genuine thought about existence problems requires the thinker to remain, as he puts it, present to himself in existence as he thinks. Such self-presence need not be thematic and reflective. It manifests itself when problems and possibilities show up pre-reflectively as problems and possibilities for me. So conceived, moreover, self-presence is affective as well as cognitive, inflected with pathos. Its affective dimensions evidently help to explain why, in Climacus's view, self-presence can be fostered through encounters with limit paradoxes. One should not think ill of paradoxes, he writes, because the paradox is the passion of thought, and a thinker without a paradox is like a lover without passion. For his part, as we've seen, Hegel does not at all dismiss paradoxes, for example, by joining with those who regard them as mere trifles, since he emphasizes their value as spurs to inquiry. Nonetheless, Climacus's remark carries a critical edge. For in Hegel's account of the perspective from which all paradoxes are ultimately resolved, the fixed oppositions that structure our ordinary understanding are, quote, the product of their concept's own reflection, and it's the concept itself that keeps them steadily in view, moves them as their soul, and brings out their dialectic. What's Hegel? Karen de Boer remarks admiringly, quote, by thus treating pure concepts, and by the same token any mode of thought as if they were living beings, Hegel has brought about a philosophical revolution, the importance of which, in my opinion, equals the one initiated by Kant. But the critical edge to Climacus's remark comes from his insistence that the living beings whose passions are engaged by paradoxes are not thoughts themselves, but existing thinkers. What kinds of pathos befit self-presence in thought? It certainly includes the affective dimensions of being struck by a paradox, feelings of perplexity, disorientation, perhaps also wonder or frustration. For Climacus, also, however, what's also required is what he calls a compound of jest and earnest. This affective bivalence is modelled by Climacus himself in the self-consciously humorous, even capricious way he presents and explores limit paradoxes. The same sort of bivalence is also exemplified by the arresting gesture right at the end of Postscript, you've read about 600 pages by this point, in which he declares that everything he has written is, quote, to be understood in such a way that it's revoked. Rather than reducing his project to a mere jest, as some commentators have proposed, this act of revocation can instead be read as reflecting Climacus's aim to present his whole literary endeavour as itself a kind of performative paradox. P, but I take it back. Here the comparison with More's paradox is closer still. By drawing us into this performative paradox as readers, Climacus does all he can to prevent us from receiving his text merely as detached spectators in a spirit of contemplative repose. To conclude then, Kierkegaard draws on Hegel's understanding of paradoxes and their place in the dynamics of inquiry. He does not deny that some paradoxes can be resolved by ascent to a higher level of analysis. His objection, rather, is to the claim that all paradoxes can be treated in this way. For he maintains, on the contrary, that some paradoxes have their source in the perspectival limits of human thought as such. Such paradoxes, limit paradoxes as I've called them, have the paradigmatic form P, but I can't think it. They characteristically involve negative concepts, such as the unknown, sinfulness, death. Kierkegaard supposes that encounters with such paradoxes, boundary skirmishes, as it were, are apt to provide a corrective to any conception of human thought or reason that abstracts away from their situatedness in the lives of human thinkers. As he conceives them, however, limit paradoxes are not simply unyielding obstacles to thought and inquiry, for they still have the potential to act as spurs, not by motivating ascent to a higher level of analysis, but instead by reorienting our thinking toward existential problems. In Wittgenstein's phrase, back to the rough ground. So conceived, limit paradoxes play a central role in Kierkegaard's vision of a positive philosophical alternative, one that seeks to incorporate rather than neutralize our human responsiveness to that which resists explaining. Okay, so in response to all of this, perhaps someone is inclined to say, hold on, Watts, haven't you undermined the very thing you're trying to bring into view by describing in a detached scholarly way limit paradoxes and their potential to helpfully reorient our thinking? Well, if only for the moment, please allow me to reply in the spirit of Climacus, mea culpa, but I take it back. Thank you.